Blackwater Canyon keeps its dead the way other ground keeps its roots. In 1885, in a side hollow of that West Virginia gorge, the Miller family went silent through a winter no one could reach them in. They were found dead, all of them, with no mark on a single body and no sign that anyone had fought or run. The cabin was intact, the door was whole, and there was nothing in the room that explained what had taken them. So the hollow reached for the only word it had, and the word was curse. There is a kind of silence that only lives in the mist-shrouded canyons of the high Allegheny, and it isn't the quiet of an empty room. It's thicker than that, and older. It's the kind that settles into a place and refuses to leave. Blackwater Canyon sits in Tucker County, in the northeastern corner of what was then a young and rough state, and the river that carved it cut a gorge over 1,000 feet deep into the rock. For most of the century before, the people who mapped the country simply went around it, because going through wasn't worth the trouble it cost. The high Allegheny was bypassed by development for decades while settlement pushed north and south of it, and that left the canyon and its side hollows in a kind of held breath. It was an empty land, but it was close to it. The few who tried to live inside those walls lived by the land's rules, and not by anyone else's. A homestead tucked into a fold of that canyon wasn't a house on a street in the foothills. It was a bet against the mountain, and the mountain always held the odds. The year 1885 sat in a narrow and strange window, because the old total isolation of that region was just beginning to crack, but it hadn't cracked yet where it mattered. And the old isolation was still in charge. Henry Gassaway Davis, a coal and timber man, and a former senator, had laid the first tracks of his railroad into eastern West Virginia in 1881, and by 1884 the iron had reached the edges of the country around what would become the town of Davis. Davis and Thomas took their names from him and his brother. The railroad was the thin edge of a timber boom that was starting to claw into the high country. But the push through Blackwater Canyon itself didn't come until 1888, 3 years after the winter we're walking into, and that gap is the whole shape of the story. 3 years is a long time in a place like that. In 1885, the railroad was arriving at the fringes, and a family homesteaded in a side hollow of the canyon was still beyond the reach of it, beyond the reach of the towns, and beyond the reach of anything that could come fast when things went wrong. What beyond it meant was simple and total. It meant no road, no telephone, no telegraph, no doctor, and no law officer. Within a walk a sick man could make. The only lines of contact were the foot trails that wound along the ridges and down through the trees. The only safety net was the goodwill of the few neighboring families scattered through the valleys. A hard walk to the nearest settlement was an hour or more in good weather, and in a bad winter that same walk could take days, or it could stop being possible at all. The dirt tracks that passed for roads became impassable mud and snow as soon as the cold set in, and a hollow could be cut off for stretches of weeks without anyone outside thinking anything of it. That wasn't a disaster to the people who lived there. It was simply the way the world worked from October to April. That was just winter. So when you stand in 1885 at the rim of that canyon and look down into the folds where the Millers built their life, you're looking at a place that the country had nearly forgotten it contained. The railroad was coming, the timber money was coming, the new century with its new answers was coming, but none of it had arrived at the floor of that gorge yet. What had arrived there was a family and a winter, and the kind of silence that doesn't let go. The country had forgotten them already. The Millers weren't a single couple out in the woods. They were a kin household, the way mountain families actually lived, and the hollow remembered them as a cluster of adults, bound by blood and by the work of staying alive. They were a unit, not just a household. The story carries the patriarch as Hezekiah Miller, a man past his middle years with a face that the neighbors described as weathered before it was old, and his wife Ada, who kept the cabin and the stores and the quiet authority that the women of those hollows held without ever announcing it. With them lived Hezekiah's brother, Orrin, a quieter man, who worked the harder ground and said less than anyone thought a man could say and still be counted alive. A grown son named Cyrus had the strength of the family in his back and the neighbors liked to recall the same heavy stillness in his eyes that his father carried. There were no children of record in the story, and that detail matters, because it's one of the things the Hollow turned over and over in the years after. A household of adults is a household that can work and defend itself, and a household of adults dying all at once, without a mark, asks a question that a household with the young in it doesn't quite ask in the same way. The Millers weren't the weak kind of family that the mountain was supposed to take first. That's part of what made what happened to them so hard to set down. The mountain doesn't take the strong ones first. How they lived was how the mountaineers lived, self-sufficient, by necessity and fierce about it, because depending on the outside wasn't a choice the canyon offered them. They grew what the thin hollow soil would give, kept a few head of livestock, cut the wood that heated the cabin, and cooked their food, and put up what they could against the months when the ground gave nothing back. The isolation wasn't poverty to them, and it wasn't failure. It was the ordinary shape of a life in a place that didn't owe anyone a road or a store or a doctor. The character the Hollow assigned them was the character the place rewarded, which is to say taciturn, inward, the kind of kin who respected their neighbors by leaving them alone and expected the same in return. They traded when trading was needed, they spoke when speaking was required, and outside of that they kept the door of the cabin pointed at their own concerns and not at anyone else's. The mountaineers were loyal to their own blood above everything, and the Millers were loyal to theirs, in the particular way that made the rest of the Hollow respect them, and also in a quieter way keep a distance. Distance was its own kind of respect, because there was something else the neighbors carried about the Millers, a weight that sat on the family's name before the winter of 1885 ever arrived. The story doesn't name it yet, and the Hollow didn't name it in daylight, but there was a sense that this was a house that had seen ruin before, a bloodline that had already lost more than its share and hadn't finished losing. People didn't say it out loud at the time, because saying it out loud wasn't the custom of those mountains. Some things you don't say out loud. They thought it, though, and the thinking of it is what later filled the silence the Millers left behind. You can understand a family like that if you've spent any time in the kind of country that made them, because the country didn't produce cheerful and open people. It produced people who held their goods and their grief close to the wall and didn't invite company to either. The Millers weren't hated and they weren't loved. They were simply present, doing the work of living in a place that took more than it gave, and carrying something in the line of them that the Hollow could feel but couldn't name. That unnamed weight is the seed of everything that grew up around their deaths, and it was already in the ground before the first snow fell. The last time anyone from the Hollow could later remember seeing a Miller alive was a small and ordinary thing, the kind of half-contact that passed for closeness out where a visit cost a half a day. The story carries it as a trade at the edge of the trail, a neighbor walking a stretch of the ridge and crossing paths with Orrin, who handed over some cured meat and took back salt and said almost nothing in the exchange. That was the way Orrin said almost nothing in every exchange the neighbors could recall. He remembered the meeting mostly because it was the last one. That's how these things always work in hindsight, the unremarkable moment that becomes the marker, because nothing came after it. Winter came in hard that year, and it came in early, the way it did in the high country, and the trails that connected the Miller Hollow to the rest of the valley turned first to mud and then to something worse. The canyon walls and the river made travel difficult, even in the good months, and once the cold locked the ground and the snow came down through the trees, a walk to the Miller place stopped being a chore. It started being a question of whether a man wanted to risk the ridge in the white. The dirt roads that the wider county counted on became impassable, and the side trails that the Hollow counted on simply stopped being there. A long silence from a homestead like the Millers wasn't, in itself, a cause for alarm, because the math of that life made silence normal for weeks at a stretch. A family that could feed itself and heat itself, and had no reason to walk out, and the neighbors had their own winter to survive, and their own wood to cut, and their own kin to mind. So the first week of quiet from the Miller Hollow passed without comment, and the second passed with a thought, and nothing more. It was only as the silence grew past the point that even that country called ordinary that the thought began to turn into a worry. Ordinary has a limit, even in the hills. What the Hollow couldn't have known, and what the story doesn't pretend to explain, is what was happening inside the cabin during those days, because no one who walked that trail ever came back with a living account of it. The silence that came down over the Miller place was the kind that the neighbors read as the ordinary silence of a winter-bound family, and it wasn't, and the gap between what they assumed and what was actually there is the space the whole story lives in. By the time the worry turned into a decision, the decision was already too late for it to matter. Too late is the shape of this story. What they expected, the few men who finally made the walk, was to find the family cold and short on stores, or cross with the weather, or simply uninterested in company, and any of those would have been the normal end to the silence. But the weather and the quiet were telling them was something else, and they could feel it on the trail before they ever saw the cabin, in the way the smoke wasn't rising from the chimney and the air around the place sat flat and wrong. They walked the last stretch of the ridge with the sense that they were walking toward an answer they hadn't actually wanted to ask for. They were. The door of the cabin was closed, and that was the first thing the men saw when they came down off the ridge, and the detail that the Hollow would return to, again and again in the telling of it. The door wasn't broken, it wasn't forced, it was simply closed, the way a door is closed by someone who closed it from the inside and had no reason to expect they'd need to open it for anyone. Men stood in front of it for a moment, that the story says was longer than it should have been, and then one of them reached out and pushed it open. Cold came out with it, and not only the cold of the weather. What was on the other side of that door is what the Hollow spent the next 40 years trying to find a name for, and the name it finally settled on is the reason this story is still being told. The light that came through the door fell on a room that was in every visible way exactly as a working cabin should be, and exactly as it shouldn't have been, and the men who walked into it understood both of those things at once. On the table sat the remains of a meal that had been set out and never cleared. The pots were where pots belong. The chairs were drawn up as if the people who sat in them had only just stood. Nothing in the arrangement of the room said that anything had been disturbed. It was the picture of a household interrupted in the middle of its ordinary evening. The household was dead. Every member of the family was there, and every one of them was gone, and the men found them not scattered or crumpled in the attitudes of flight, but in positions that the Hollow couldn't make fit with any kind of violence. Hezekiah was near the hearth, Ada was at the table, Orrin was against the wall by the door. He had spent his life not quite speaking through, and Cyrus was across the room where the story places him, and none of them looked like a man who had been fighting when he died. They looked, the men said later, like people who had simply stopped, each in the spot where the stopping had found him. That was the part that stayed with the ones who found them. The first wrong thing the men registered wasn't the bodies. It was the absence of any sign that a struggle had happened in that room. Because a struggle leaves a signature, and there was no signature anywhere. No chair was overturned, no shelf was swept clean, no board was split, and the fire in the hearth had burned down to ash on its own schedule, without anyone feeding it or knocking it loose. It had the stillness of a place that had been left alone, not the wreckage of a place that had been visited by something that had to fight to get in. The room was too still for a killing. There was no blood, not a drop of it, not on the floor, and not on the bodies, and not on the tools that hung where they belonged on the wall. There was no weapon, neither one of the family's own, nor one that a stranger might have brought in and left behind, and the men searched the room and the yard for either, and found nothing that answered the question of how 4 people had died in the same small space. The door was whole, the windows were whole, and there was no mark on the logs to show where force had been applied to any way in or out. Nothing was broken. What the men felt, the story says, wasn't the horror of a scene full of gore, because there was no gore to feel it over, but a deeper and colder wrongness that came from the lack of one. A killing, you can see, is a killing you can name, and a killing you can name is a killing you can begin to put away. But a room full of the dead, with no visible cause, has no handle on it and no place to start. The men stood in that cabin and understood that they were looking at something that didn't fit any kind of death they'd been taught to recognize. The absence of a cause was itself the most frightening thing in the room. They had come up the ridge, expecting to find a family short on food or short on temper, and instead they had found a family short on life, and they had found it in a room that refused to tell them how it had happened. The scene was too clean to read as a killing, and too final to read as anything else, and that contradiction is what the men carried back down the ridge with them when they left the cabin and closed the whole door behind them. They didn't know yet what they had found, because there was no word for it yet in the language they had. What they knew was that they would have to find one, and that it would have to be a heavy one. A heavy word for a heavy room. In the years of retelling the Hollow, fixated on a handful of specifics from inside that room, because specifics are what a story uses to keep its shape when the shape has no explanation. The bodies bore no wounds, the men could find no bruises, no burns, no swelling, no discoloration of the skin that would have told a reading eye what kind of sickness had come through. Men who looked weren't doctors, but they had seen enough death in their lives to know what a diseased body looked like, and what a beaten one looked like. The Miller dead looked like neither. That's the detail that the story preserves most carefully of all. The food was still on the table, or near it, and the meal had been laid out as if the family had sat to eat, and hadn't finished, and hadn't cleared, which is the ordinary mess of a household, until the household stops being ordinary. The fire had gone cold long before the men arrived. The cabin had frozen around the bodies in the days of the silence, and the cold had preserved the scene in a way that made it feel less like a death and more like a display. Everything the family had been touching was still where they had touched it. Nothing had moved since the last hand had lifted from it. The thing that broke the men the most, and the thing that the Hollow returned to most often, was the simple fact that no one in that family had fought. A family doesn't die together, not all at once, not in a single room, without at least one of them reaching for a door or a child or a weapon or the window. And the Miller room showed no reaching of any kind. No one reached for anything. They had gone quiet, all of them, inside the same narrow window of time, and they had gone quiet in place, as if whatever had taken them had moved through the room so fast and so completely that not one of them had the moment it would have taken to try. And yet, the taking had left the cabin exactly as it was, which is the part that pushes the scene past the ordinary horror of death and into something the men had no category for. A force fast enough to drop 4 adults where they stood would have left some sign of its passing, some mark on the door, or the walls, or the bodies, and a sickness fast enough to take a whole room would have left its color and its swelling on the skin. The Miller cabin showed neither. The men stood in the middle of that absence and felt the weight of a death that had been thorough enough to empty a family, and clean enough to leave no trace of how it had done it. Whatever had come into that room had come in and gone out without breaking anything, without bleeding anyone, and without giving a single one of the people inside it the time to understand what was happening to them. It had taken the Millers so fast and so completely that the family hadn't run, hadn't fought, and hadn't left the men who found them a single clue to follow out of the room. That's what the story carries forward, and that's what the men who walked in couldn't unsee. And none of it had a name that any of them had been raised to use. They had no name for it. The narrator holds the line here, because the line is the whole point, and the line is that this is what the oral tradition of the Hollow preserves, and not what any record proves. The scene is impossible by every frame the neighbors had, and impossible scenes don't stay impossible for long in a place that can't afford to leave them open. Something was going to fill the blank where the cause should have been, because something always does. Blanks don't stay blank for long. What filled it would have less to do with what actually happened in that cabin than with what the Hollow could stand to believe happened. The reason no one ever made sense of the Miller deaths is the same reason the deaths were able to happen unseen, and it's the reason the story turned into a legend instead of a case, and it's structural. In a side hollow of Tucker County in 1885, there was no coroner with any training in the dead, no physician within a walk a sick man could make, and no sheriff who could arrive before the bodies had stopped being bodies. The county seat and its authority barely reached the deep hollows in the best weather, and in a winter like that one the law was as cut off as the family it would have been asked to examine, and the law couldn't get there. What the neighbors did instead was what the mountaineers always did with their dead, which was to handle the matter themselves, and to handle it with the rituals the place had developed in the absence of anyone else to handle it. They washed the bodies and laid them out, and they observed the customs the hollow had carried for as long as anyone could remember, the customs that existed, to help a spirit leave a house, to keep the living safe from what stayed behind. The living had to be protected too. They covered the mirrors so the dead wouldn't see themselves and linger. Then they stopped the clocks so the household wouldn't keep the hour of its ending in its walls. They turned the bodies toward the door in the way the tradition asked, so that whatever came to collect them could find its way out and not get trapped in the room with the living. And that custom tells you something about how the hollow thought of death even before the millers. Death wasn't only an ending, it was a passage that had to be managed, and a mismanaged passage left something in the house that didn't belong there. The neighbors did these things for the millers because no one else was going to do them, and because not doing them was more frightening than the deaths themselves. The absence that mattered most, and the absence that decided everything that came after, was the absence of any person with the learning to look at those bodies and write down what had actually killed them. No one with training ever saw the millers dead, and so no one ever recorded a cause, and the deaths entered the memory of the hollow with a blank in the place where the explanation should have been. A blank is a dangerous thing to leave. That blank isn't a small thing because a death with no cause doesn't stay empty, and a whole family dead with no cause is a blank that a community won't leave open for long. The hollow couldn't live beside the unexplained killing of an entire household, and simply leave the question sitting there, because an open question of that size is a thing that eats at the walls of a community and at the sleep of the people inside it. People can live with a death they understand, even a terrible one, but a death they can't understand is a death that could come for them next, and that isn't a thing anyone can carry in peace. So the blank was going to be filled. The only question was what would fill it, and the answer to that question was already in the culture of the place waiting. The story turns here, from the bodies on the floor to the belief that rose up around them, and this is the turn where the script shifts from the crime to the folklore that swallowed it. Gossip began in the hollow and moved out along the trails. The way everything moved out along the trails, slowly and by word of mouth. And the first word it settled on was the word the hook already gave you, which was curse. The word didn't come from nowhere, and it didn't come from panic. It came from the way the people of those mountains had always made sense of ruin that had no ordinary cause. A run of bad luck that couldn't be explained was already in the thinking of the 1,880 seconds. Hollow, understood as a weight that traveled down a bloodline, and a family destroyed without a mark, wasn't a puzzle to be solved, but a debt come due. A curse worked by giving a shape to suffering that had no other shape, and the shape it gave was a story with a beginning and a reason and an end, which is a thing the human mind can hold where it can't hold a blank. People would rather hold a terrible shape than no shape at all. The millers died in a way that broke every frame the hollow had. The curse was the one frame left that could hold the whole of it without cracking. The neighbors who reached for the word weren't acting out of malice, and the story is clear about that, because malice would have been simpler and smaller than what was actually at work. They were acting out of the desperate need to make the impossible mean something, and to make it mean something that stayed inside the miller line and didn't leak out into the rest of the hollow. If the deaths were a curse, then they belonged to the millers, to the blood and the history the family carried, and not to the canyon or the winter or the air that everyone else in the valley was breathing. The air was the thing they feared. That's the comfort of a curse, and it's a cold comfort, but a real one, because it draws a line around the dead and tells the living that they're on the safe side of it. A curse has a target, and a target means there are people who aren't the target. And in a hollow that has just found an entire family dead without a cause, the existence of a target is the thing that lets the rest of them sleep. Sleep matters more than truth in a hollow like that. The neighbors weren't cursing the Millers, they were saving themselves, and the word they reached for was the wall they built between the family's ending and their own continuing. So the gossip took hold, the way a fire takes hold in a dry season, not because anyone wanted it, but because the ground was ready for it, and there was nothing else to burn. The Hollow had a world, with its own unwritten laws, and its own ways of reading the unexplainable, and in that world a whole family, dead with no mark, wasn't a mystery. It was a verdict already written, and only now read aloud. The word curse moved from the first neighbor, who said it to the next and to the next. Word travels fast in a scared hollow. By the time it had run the length of the valley, it had stopped being an opinion and started being the answer. Once the word was in the air, the memory of the hollow began to work backward. The way memory does when it has an answer, it wants to fit the question to, and the neighbors started to recall the signs they now believed had warned of the deaths. A bird had been at the window of the Miller cabin in the weeks before, or someone said there had been, and a bird at a window in the tradition of those mountains wasn't a small thing. It was a warning that someone in the house would die. A dog had howled through a night for no reason the owner could find, and a rooster had crowed at an hour no rooster was supposed to crow, and each of these was a death omen the culture had been reading for generations. The culture had been reading them longer than anyone could count. The wind had changed sudden. One neighbor remembered the kind of shift the old belief read as a message coming, and in a hollow where the land and the weather were watched as closely as the weather is watched anywhere, a sudden wind was a thing that registered. These were the omens the tradition held, the bird and the dog, and the rooster, and the wind, and the hollow didn't invent them after the fact so much as it resorted the ordinary disturbances of a mountain winter into the order of a warning. And the signs had been there, the neighbors now said, if anyone had known how to read them. The failure to read them was part of what made the deaths feel earned rather than random. Earned is easier to live with than random. These omens are real, and that's a careful word to use, because they're real as belief and not as prophecy. And the distinction is the one the narrator has to hold all the way through. The people of the 1880 Seconds Hollow believed these signs with the same conviction they brought to the turning of the seasons, and that belief is what made the curse feel confirmed, rather than merely suspected. Omens didn't prove the curse. They proved that the culture already had a place for a death like this one, and the place was waiting, and the Miller deaths fit into it as neatly as a hand fits into a glove that was sewn for it. The fit was the frightening part. There was, the story also carries, a woman in the hollow of the kind the people turned to before and above any doctor, the older woman who kept the herbs and the charms and the reading of the signs, the figure the tradition calls the granny. What she was said to have seen in the weeks before the deaths, or what she was said to have refused to name out loud. The story keeps vague because the power of that figure was always partly in what she wouldn't say. The hollow believed she had known something was coming, and the belief that someone had known is another way of saying that the thing was knowable, and a knowable thing is a thing with rules, and a thing with rules is a thing you can live beside. Rules are what the hollow could live with. The cruel comfort of the omens is the same comfort as the curse, and it runs in the same direction, because if the signs were there before the deaths, then the deaths weren't random, they were written, and a written death is a death that follows a pattern. A pattern is a thing a community can live with, even a terrible pattern, because a pattern implies a rule, and a rule implies a boundary, and a boundary implies that some people are inside the danger, and some are outside it. Omens let the hollow go on, believing that the world still had rules, just terrible ones. That belief is what let the rest of the valley keep walking its trails after dark. The dark was easier to walk with rules. The question of where the curse was said to have started is the question the hollow answered with the family's own history, and the answer it gave runs back before the winter of 1885 to a generation the story carries only in fragments. The Millers in the memory of the valley hadn't been a lucky line, and the ruin that took them in that cabin was understood as the end of something that had been winding down the family for years before anyone thought to call it a curse. A farm had gone out of the name in the years before, or a piece of ground the family had worked had turned and stopped giving, and the loss of it was the kind of loss the hollow filed under the heading of a bloodline turning sour. A line can turn sour slowly, and no one names it in time. There was a death in the line before the deaths in the cabin, the story says. A death that didn't sit right with the people who remembered it, a passing that came at an odd hour or in an odd way, and that the neighbors had quietly marked at the time. There was a quarrel, too, the kind the mountain tradition loved to carry, a falling out over land, or kin, or a debt that turned the wrong way, and the memory of it was the kind of memory that gets sharper the further it gets from the event. These are the pieces the hollow assembled into the origin of the curse, and they're the pieces that made the word fit, because a curse needs a beginning and a wrong to begin from. Every curse starts with a wrong. Why the bloodline frame held so well is the same reason the curse held so well, which is that the deaths in the cabin didn't look like an accident or a sickness anyone could name, but they did look like the last beat of a rhythm the family had been keeping for a while. A run of loss, a wrong death, a quarrel that soured, and then a whole household gone in a single winter. The shape of that sequence is the shape a curse is supposed to take, the slow winding down and the sudden end. The hollow didn't have to twist the family's history to make it fit the curse. History already had the curve of one, and the cabin only completed the arc that the rest of the line had been drawing. It was the end of a long sentence. The narrator's distance here is the distance the channel asks for, and it's the distance that keeps the story honest, which is that this is what the hollow believed about the bloodline and not what anyone proved. Belief, in a place without a doctor or a record, is the thing that makes a story true enough to live by. And a curse that the community believes in is a curse that does the work of a curse, whether it was ever laid or not. The Millers didn't die because of a story. They became a story because of how they died. And the story the hollow chose was the story of a bloodline that had been marked and that finally came due. The curse, then, had a beginning in the family's past and an end in the family's cabin, and in between, it had the shape of a debt that gathers interest across the years and pays itself out all at once. That's the logic the hollow used, and it's the logic that turned the Miller deaths from a horror with no handle into a narrative with a beginning and a middle and an end. And a narrative is a thing a community can carry where it can't carry a blank. The bloodline gave the curse its origin, and the origin gave the curse its weight, and the weight is what pressed the word down into the memory of the valley until it couldn't be lifted back out. And the word sank in, and it stayed. The verdict that took hold in the valley was the verdict the culture was always going to reach, and it was that the Millers died, under a generational curse that came due in the winter of 1885, in a cabin no help could reach. That became the answer. The hollow repeated to itself and to its children, and it became the answer that was passed along the trails until it hardened into something harder than an opinion, and closer to a fact of the place. The curse was the verdict, not because it was solved, but because it was the only verdict the hollow had the tools to return. A verdict returned is a question closed, and a question closed is a thing a community can rest beside. Rest is what the hollow was after. A legend consolidates the way a river does, by wearing away the parts that don't fit and deepening the parts that do. And the Miller story went through that work in the years after the deaths. The details that argued against a curse, the oddnesses that might have pointed another way, got smoothed out of the telling, and the details that confirmed one got sharper every time the story passed through a new mouth. The absence of any official cause of death left nothing to push back against the story, because there was no record to contradict, and no authority to contradict it. It grew in the clear space that the silence had left. Silence is good ground for a legend. The cost of the verdict is the cost that every too quick closing carries, which is that once the curse was the answer, no one looked any further, and the looking is where any other answer would have had to come from. It was closed not because it was solved, but because the hollow needed it closed, and a closed question stops gathering evidence and starts gathering atmosphere, and that's the moment a death becomes a story and a story becomes a legend. The Millers were paid the compliment of being remembered. They were paid the injury of being remembered as a curse, and both of those things happened because the valley couldn't afford to remember them any other way. The narrator holds the line, as the channel holds the line, and the line is that this isn't what happened. Because no one alive knows what happened, and this is what the mountains decided happened, which is a different and a heavier thing. What the mountains decided happened is the thing that shaped the memory of the family and the fear of the hollow and the silence of the canyon for a generation after, and that's real even if the curse wasn't. A belief that a community lives by is a belief that does the work of a truth, and the truth of the Miller story is that the hollow believed it. The believing is the part that left the mark, and the mark is still there. The frames the hollow never had are the frames a later century would bring to the same room, and they're worth holding up against the story, not to solve it from a distance, but to feel the distance itself. Distance is the point. A cabin sealed up tight against a winter, with a fire burning low and the air inside it going bad, is a cabin that can take a whole household quietly and leave no mark a neighbor in 1885 would know how to read. The cold and the closed door and the old stove are a combination that doesn't need a curse to empty a room, and it doesn't leave a wound on anyone. It takes, and it doesn't give the people inside it the time to run. A closed stove does its own quiet work. There are other quiet ways a family can go in a place like that, and the story doesn't adopt any of them as its answer, because the story isn't here to solve the case from 140 years away. A water source gone bad, food spoiled in the cold or poisoned by a mold the eye can't see, a sickness that moves fast through a closed room and stops the heart before the body can show it. A plant or a mineral in the hollow that does its work without a sound. Any of these is the kind of thing that can take a household and leave the door closed behind it. The door stays closed either way. Each of them is a frame. The 1,880 seconds hollow didn't have the words or the tools to reach for. Each of them sits beside the curse without tipping the story toward it or away. The point of holding the modern frames up isn't to replace the curse with a cleaner answer, because a cleaner answer isn't what the story is for, and the story earns its weight by never giving one. It's the gap between then and now, the gap between a hollow that had no physician and no chemistry, and a world that has both, and the gap is where the meaning of the Miller story actually lives. The curse wasn't a failure of reason in the people who reached for it, it was the only reason they had, and judging them for it is a way of misunderstanding the country that made them, and the century that left them without a better word. The narrator keeps the supernatural and the scientific unresolved against each other, and that's the discipline the channel asks for, because a story that tips the scale either way stops being a mystery and starts being an argument, and an argument is a smaller thing than a mystery. A mystery is the heavier thing to carry. The Millers died in a way that resists a clean explanation, and they died in a place that had no clean explanation to offer. And the curse is what grew in the space between the death and the language. Whether the curse was real, or whether the truth was quieter and colder, is a question the story refuses to close. Refusing to answer is what keeps the cabin cold in the telling of it, and the cold is what travels. What became of the Miller homestead is what becomes of a place that a community has decided to leave alone, which is that the community left it alone, and the place went back to the work of being a place. The family was gone, and the cabin stood, and the hollow treated the ground the way the tradition treated ground that had taken a household, with a distance and a kind of deference that didn't need to be announced to be understood. The trail to the Miller place wasn't a trail. Anyone walked for pleasure after the deaths, and the cabins in those mountains didn't get new families moving in when the old ones left in a way the valley couldn't explain. Nobody wanted the ground. The land reabsorbed the homestead the way the land reabsorbs everything, in a canyon that old, and the forest is patient, in a way that people aren't, and within a generation the trace of the Millers had gone vague, the way a trail goes vague when no feet keep it. What went back to the trees was the cabin itself, the roof first and then the walls, and the gorge that had held the family continued the way a gorge continues, without grief and without memory and without any of the weight the hollow had piled onto the name. The canyon doesn't keep a record, it keeps a silence, and the silence it kept over the Miller Hollow was the same silence it had kept before the family ever built there. The story outlasted the place because stories are the thing that does outlast the place, and the Miller story was carried the way the mountains carry everything, in the silences between what people will say out loud and in the telling that gets sharper as the ground gets vaguer. The cabin is gone, and the trail is gone, and the people who walked it are gone. What stayed was the telling. It's still here, which is the way of the legends, the hollows of the high Allegheny kept, and the way of the ones this channel brings back into the light. A family died beyond the reach of help, with no mark on any of them, and the only language their world had for it was a word, and so a word is what they became. The mountains didn't need the curse to be true. They only needed the silence to stay closed, and it did, for as long as anyone could remember. Subscribe if you want more of the stories the mountains kept silent, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.